Praful from Corrosion Radar, host of CUI Coffee, promoting online discussions within CUI community to exchange experiences and ideas. I'm very pleased to welcome our panel today, industry leaders in their respective fields. We have Billy McKay from Total. Hi, Billy.
Good morning. How are you?
Yeah, great, Billy. And Bruce McKenzie from Oceaneering. Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Prafal.
Good to see you both. And uh, let me first start with introductions. Billy, would you like to introduce yourself in a few words, and then we'll go to Bruce?
Okay, my name is Billy McKay. I'm the inspection leader here with Total in Aberdeen. I've been in the industry now for more than 35 years. So I've got quite a lot of experience, including CUI.
Right. Thank you, Billy. Over to Bruce.
Hi, Prafal. I'm Bruce McKenzie. I'm a technical manager in integrity management at Oceaneering. And I've been in the industry since the late 90s, and I've been involved in CUI all the time.
Great. Welcome to you both, and it's exciting times to have you here. I'm also excited to mention that this community of CUI or Coffee is rapidly expanding. Today we have over 200 registrations across about 270 companies and across 25 countries, which is fantastic. So it's rapidly growing community. It's great to have this topic today. Today's topic is CUI management, from design to late life. And I believe with both Billy and Bruce on the panel today, that brings tremendous amount of experience, especially operating from Aberdeen, which is a hub for oil industry and represents not only the upstream, but also midstream and downstream of the oil industry. So just before we start, some housekeeping rules and pointers for the audience. We will spend about not more than 25 minutes in the panel discussion. We'll have a few polls in between for the audience, and this will give us enough time to have some interaction after the panel discussions, probably about half an hour for question and answers. So our intention is to start at a high level, at a broad umbrella level, and then going into details of CUI and experiences as we build together the discussion. And during the question answers, it will be deeper. So I think I'm expecting deep questions, which our panel is very capable of addressing. So there is a question and answer option available at the bottom of the screen of the webinar, which the audience can write their questions during the session, and they will be answered in the later half of this session. You can always email at webinars@corrosionradar.com for additional questions or some questions which we have not answered. So that will be always be an open channel. Also, I would like to mention that we will try to give mic to some interesting questions, people from who are asking some relevant questions. If the time permits, we will do that so that you can ask directly and interact, be a part of this discussion. So shall we start? Bruce, Billy, has everyone got a coffee, hot drink, masala tea in India, as we call, or kahwa in Middle East, and our friends from South America who's joining today, mate for you. So that's start of the coffee. I think in the next 30 minutes we'll be done with it, but then we'll go to question answers. So opening, so corrosion and insulation, CUI, a major asset integrity issue. Even after several decades, we are still talking about it. There have been developments, but there have been best practices, but people are working in silos. And that's our attempt today to break that. So Billy and Bruce, I will pass first to Billy. What are your opening thoughts about CUI? When you hear this word, what comes to your mind? Good, bad. Over to you, Billy.
So Praful, I think you mentioned there's a long history of CUI. So yeah, my first experience of CUI goes back to the mid 1980s, UK, offshore North Sea. One of the major operators had a plant in Shetland, Sullomvo terminal, had a huge CUI problem there. fairly soon after startup. That kind of set the ball rolling for the rest of the North Sea. So that is over 30 years ago, Praful. And the industry, UK, North Sea, are still having CUI problems. So I think from my perspective, it's been a really, really difficult challenge. Total recognized that challenge some time ago when the Oil and Gas Technology Centre was set up. And Total were instrumental in ensuring that CUI was a topic for the OGTC to pursue.
Thank you, Billy. It's an old issue, as you mentioned, and this goes back to, you know, when I met you first time in probably 2015, 2016, when we had this workout in Aberdeen. Industry leaders got together and talked about what is best out for the CUI. So it was recognized at that time, and probably not much have changed except few technologies here and there. So thanks for that. Bruce, what is your experience? What comes to your mind when we talk about CUI?
CUI, one of my first thoughts, I've got a very nice example of a CUI failure. It's a real life spool that it sits near my desk in the new office. We've moved offices mid-March, but we've not really spent any time in the new office. But I've taken this sample and set it near my desk. It's a North Sea example from an offshore platform, a 4-inch carbon steel gas recycle line. Now, it operated at 36 bar and 100 Celsius. So it was, I'm not sure the exact thickness, I'd measure it if I could, but I'm not in the office. I think it's quite thin wall, shed 80, about 8-9 mil. And it was in service for about 25 years before it ruptured, full bore rupture, and released a ton of hydrocarbon gas, at least a ton. And thankfully there were no fires or injuries. But it's just a classic example. It focuses the mind. This is what CUI can do. Late life, thin wall, carbon steel. The temperature was in the high probability zone. Very high consequence safety business. So it's a real good example. If anybody's in the office, I'll easily show you. It's classic CUI. So that's one of my thoughts on CUI.
So thanks, Bruce. I think the common theme here is that we have talked about CUI for decades and decades, but it's still a problem worth solving. It's still happening, and there's some change needed, and that's why we are discussing it today as to what should we do and what are the best practices. So this brings me to the launching of our first poll for the audience today. Moderator, can you just launch the first poll? So this is for the audience to answer. There are 3 questions here, mainly about CUI, and also to relate it to that condition, we have also asked about which industry you represent and which geography you represent, because the problems and management of CUI is dependent on the regions. Different regions react to it differently. So we would like to get a feel for how this different regions are. This is an anonymous poll, and we'll share the results shortly of this. So please answer this, audience. Select your answers, and we will share the results. So meanwhile, while the audience is selecting the questions, Bruce, you mentioned about a pipe which was sitting on a desk, which was heavily CUI. And then when you look at it, what prompts you to change in the industry? Is it something related to, say, design, or is it something related to how can we manage it better? How can we do firefighting about it? So what's your inherent drive when you look at this problem?
Yeah, it's a major safety concern, CUI and thin wall gas, for example, this one. So it's really right through from the design stage. If you get the design right, that helps, but then managing it all the way from design, feed, commissioning, right through early operations, it's basically needs managed right through from early life to late life, and it's more challenging late life, coating conditions and all sorts. So it's definitely a topic that should be managed from cradle to grave, the CUI. It can catch you out anytime.
So let's see what our audience says. Can we have the results of the poll on the screen? So these are the results. I think we have, so overwhelmingly, the first question is about, in your opinion, at what stage should a CUI management strategy be considered? 92% of our audience thinks should be considered at design and construction or early operations. And in fact, 0% of the audience is saying mature operations. It should be considered at mature operations, so which is revealing. And I'm sure we'll come to that, Billy and Bruce, about this view. And do you agree to that? And how do we respond? The second question is, which option describes your industry best? So oil and gas is 70% among the audience, 12% is petrochemicals, 4% is chemicals, and interestingly, 8% is from other industries. So if you relate to this, oil and gas and design and construction, they're kind of, that's where the correlation is coming in. Which geographical regions are you based at? Today's audience. So 8% from Asia Pacific are joining today. Europe and Russia are 71%. Middle East and Africa is 15%, and Americas is 7%. So we have a global audience today, and they are responding that most of them are from oil and gas and petrochemicals and chemicals, and they're responding that design and construction should be part of CUI management. So Billy, you represent the operator, and you have experience. Do you agree to this? And do you think it is happening?
I think Bruce captures it quite well there from it needs to be cradle to grave. But I think maybe another piece on that is the education piece. A lot of our in-service problems, such as CUI, are sometimes not fed back into that design and construction phase. So to me, it is, you manage it from cradle to grave, but it needs to be messaged very early on in a project, for instance, some of the real in-service problems that we have to deal with, CUI in particular, obviously.
Bruce, do you see that it should be, do you agree to the audience that, it should be done at design and construction stage? And do you see that happening now, Bruce?
I think detailed design stage is key, where you set all the standards, the specifications, any technology. It's really the foundations, how you'll move forward, applying the coating, all sorts. Once the orders are placed, then it's more problematic to change things. So detailed design, I think, is super key, but then it needs managed throughout the whole way, because some of these assets, it's not just 10, 15, 20 years, it's 30, 40 years. So what happens at design will change throughout the life of the assets, how you'll manage it. So it's certainly the foundations is at design, but everything out there offshore right now, it's too late. So we need to manage it. So it's anything moving forward. Yes, the time spent at detailed design could reap benefits for sure.
Right. So in the past, Bruce, do you think CUI management was considered at the design stage as well? We're talking about the historical perspective of the industry.
Yeah, well, some of the assets I've been on early 2000s, and they'll be out there for 30 years. And CUI, I would say it's not had the attention it should have when they were designed. They would have been designed, say, 20 years ago, and managing carbon steel pipework and assets offshore with minimal bedding, it's going to be very difficult.
Right. So it was at the design stage. In the historical perspective, it was not a priority, I presume. But now, even evident from the audience poll and all of us, that CUI needs to be considered at the design stage. So why was it not part of the design stage earlier, and why we realize it now that it should be part of the design stage? What is the barrier in the past, Bruce, and then we'll pass to Billy for his perspective.
So some it's educational because the CUI is pretty much typical failures, thin wall carbon steel. They may be happening 10, 15 years, 20 years down the line. So who's ever designing it's not going to be there 20 years later. So some of the operators that have the foresight to put in the right barriers and materials and all the technology, then they'll get the benefits. But a lot of the offshore platforms will, it's really a problem that comes later on.
Right.
So
okay.
It's a slow burner, the CUI, but it's sometimes not so slow, but typically it's later in life when it gives you an issue.
So it's a slow process, it's a long-term process, and that's why typically people don't consider at the design stage. So Billy, what is stopping CUI from being addressed at the design stage? You mentioned education is one, but is there more to it? Are there more nuisances in the process? Is it
I think
budget, or is it just not a priority, or is it a slow process? That's fine. What's your experience?
I think there is always the capital budget issue. We would all like almost a gold plating, if you put it that way. But nowadays it's the balance between capex and opex is very fine. Some projects would not fly with the capex if we wanted to design out a lot of these issues. So inevitably there are compromises, but as part of that compromise process, there needs to be an education to understand the risks to the asset going forward and to understand the risks to opex costs. If I go way back, which I referred to earlier there, in those days, we were looking for, if we stripped insulation, was it coated? Because in some cases it wasn't coated. Mm-hmm. So the whole education piece of barriers was not there back in the late 70s, early 80s. So we have come a long way, but I think there's more for us to do.
So thanks, Billy. We have come a long way, but not quite there. As you said, in the history, people did not consider coatings, barriers. Yeah. Now we are starting to consider that at the design stage. So is it, if we see technology-wise and barrier-wise, there are best practices which are coming in coatings, insulations. But is there a alignment issue between the projects team and the operations team? The late operations team typically are not involved in the design stage, or asset integrity teams typically, are they involved in the design stage to bring best practices and recommendations? What's your view?
So I've now worked for a couple of operators. One operator actually seconded a maintenance and inspection team into the design house, which was really exceptional at that time, and a lot of input into the design, input into construction, and those guys followed that project right through to operations. So that was kind of an exceptional model that I thought worked very well.
Thank you. I think there are some best practices here.
Yeah.
This brings to us to a poll number 2. Can we launch the poll number 2? Let's hear from the audience and reflect what their experiences are. So this is for the audience. Please select one option. What is the main challenge in applying an effective CUI management strategy? Budget, technology, skills, or organizational? So here, from this, while the audience is selecting the options, Bruce, do you typically see conflicts between these 4 or 5 different options? They're competing against each other, or they're not? Kind of everybody is aligned, and everybody has CUI as a major priority. What is your view?
It's mixed really, because what Billy mentioned there, Billy being an end user, a classic end user who wants the Rolls Royce, and budgets, the budget holders wanting value. So there's definite conflicts. I've seen different operators do it different ways. Where budget, they want value long term. There's technology roadmaps, and definitely I've seen embedding ops people back into the project phase. That's always worked well, and I've been involved in one or two like that, but it's not the norm. Organization, like different operators have different organizations, so there's no one size fits all in this, I'm afraid. But certainly budget's always, it's got to be financially viable, and where you can add value, where you can take out friction is always going to win. So if you can demonstrate value by doing something, then it's always got a great chance of success.
Right. So I think it's a demonstration-based message we have to give to the industry, best practices, and bring out the case studies, best practices. So let's see what the audience is saying. Can we have the answers, please, on the screen? Well, so there's a mixed answer here, which is interesting and I would say expected as well. It's kind of spread. The main challenges in applying an effective CUI management strategy, 30% of the people feel it's a budget, limitations. 20% feel technology are limiting us, tools and guidelines. 20% feels about skills, know-how and expertise, which is actually a, surprise a bit, because, skills probably the training bit, probably that's the least we can always do. And then actually 30% feel organizational, like different departments are disconnected. And probably this is a typical of the design, project engineering to say asset integrity. Are they disconnected? So who's responsible? So this brings me to the question of, who should be the responsible for making this change of having a CUI and in fact predictive corrosion management strategy in the design stage? Is it the operator, or is it the EPC prime contractor, or any other, or asset integrity team? Billy, this first you, and then I'll pass it on to Bruce. What's your view?
Okay, so I think I touched on it earlier. A lot of our in-service problems, whether it be CUI or whatever, don't necessarily get fed back to the big EPC contractors. And my view is it really is the end user, the operator, who really needs to set the specifications, the standards that the EPC contractor has to deliver against.
Right, thank you. Bruce, what do you think of this?
I'm 100% with Billy there. I would have said it exact same way. The operator must set the standards from day one.
So there's a need for, the operator or the end user needs to set the guidelines that asset integrity team and should be part of the design process or early part of the process. And that's great to hear. And it should be driven by the operator. And is that something which is happening now, Billy, you think?
Certainly from a Total perspective, yes. That is happening now. That's an important part of the picture. But surveillance of the implementation of those standards and rules throughout the project is also very important. It's all very well setting the standard right at the beginning, but you need to monitor the application of those specifications right down to the QA/QC of coatings and insulation systems.
Right. Okay. So that brings us to the third part of the panel discussion about, a lot of offshore assets are in the North Sea, especially, are aging and maturing, right? So this design process is way past. Probably some of the new floating vessels are newly designed for some offshore operations, but majority of the assets are mature. So how is this process being managed? So CUI, say firefighting about this asset integrity being managed. What are the best practices? Bruce, you have been involved day to day in this industry, in this process of late life management. What do you think? What is happening? If it is not part of the design, how is it managed at the late life?
There's a right mixture of applications. So some of the inspection tools and techniques, they're improving all the time. Definitely. The proactive maintenance and repair. Now, some of my concerns is the older assets where they're well in their life, and it's a total unknown. So the inspection side, and there's only so much you can tell from doing non-intrusive inspection. You've really got options where you could be faced with doing large-scale stripping to get absolute assurance that your coating's good, there's no significant corrosion, and typically these assets, to do that, the bedding just won't cope if it's an offshore asset for doing large campaigns, and say it's 30 years old. That's where we get some real risk. So it's a real difficult one, because the costs you may need. I've seen some good practice where they just bring in additional like a flotel and do a complete refurbishment, and then they get back to a level playing field. So it's a real difficult one late life, I think.
So late life of CUI management is very difficult, and effectively it's like firefighting. But I believe you also mentioned about proactiveness in that late life. So when you say proactiveness, what does it mean? Is it about, I hear about risk-based inspections, or being more expert-oriented? Historically, they know where the CUI is happening. What is the proactiveness about this?
Well, deploying the right inspection, some of the sensor stuff, I think, has got a big part in the future. The whole way we manage risk, I think, has got to change moving forward. So moisture sensors, the whole RBA process for which bits are at risk, and I've been doing some work on some predictive analytics that I think's coming in the next 10 years. It's got to be the way forward, but that needs embedded early in the strategy, and essentially putting the budget available so that offshore they can go in and look in year 2030 and put them back to a safe place, because the unknown with CUI, going back to what I said at the start, the full bore rupture of a gas pipe, that just lands you in court. There's no two ways about it.
Right. Okay. Thanks. You mentioned about being proactive, adopting new technologies, latest and greatest. Sensors monitoring is one piece, and analytics. Billy, what do you think about this being? Do you agree to Bruce about taking a proactive approach in late life management of CUI through technologies, and what are the technologies you think of?
Yeah, I agree with Bruce. I would just maybe a word of caution. Late life management is very, very difficult, particularly if the asset has changed ownership. You lose history. But if you've been doing a cradle to grave approach, you should, in theory, have some history that helps in your late life management. So what I would say is, if you're going at late life management and you haven't got much history to go with, you're in a hard place. So you are looking for maybe, and this is where I think the industry is really struggling, you're really looking for a data set, a large data set, cross-industry, that you can help inform your decisions. And that's something that I think the industry could do more on, is sharing data, informing you how to make some decisions, even down to where you install sensors. And, there is that piece missing in the jigsaw for me at this moment in time.
Right. Okay. So knowledge management is a question. So that brings me to the poll number 3 for the audience, which is on a similar lines. Can we launch poll number 3? How do you see CUI management evolving into the future? Is it prevention, continue with coatings and installations? They have come a long way. Or detection using increased manual inspections and NDT, or prediction, which is adopt digital analytics and continuous monitoring. So let's see what the audience says. Meanwhile, coming back to Billy, you mentioned about knowledge management, and when the ownership of the assets going from one to other, and that breaks the knowledge transfer sometimes if it's not documented well. So is knowledge management an issue with a fluid workforce like that? Do you see software being captured and sharing data so far, or are they coming?
So I think maybe a couple of points there. Certainly when the asset change ownership, that can be really difficult. You do sometimes find that some vital data, some vital inspection information is maybe not passed over. That can give you a problem. Across industry, sharing of information, I think there are soundings now that there maybe is an appetite in industry for that. And certainly I'm very supportive of sharing information and knowledge as a result.
Right. So management of the knowledge transfer is a key aspect in asset integrity and CUI management, especially when offshore assets are changing hands between operator to operator. So that's one of the key points. Let's see the answer from the audience to this question. Well, very interesting, as we all expected, and as the panel also mentioned, CUI management evolving into the future. 25% of the audience feels we should continue with coatings and insulations. Of course, barriers is the first thing. No CUI is the best thing. But interestingly, only 25% of the people feel that. Probably there's a confidence question about whether coatings and insulations perform the way they should to avoid CUI. Interestingly, only 5% of the people believe increased manual inspection and NDT is a solution, or it's going to be the best practice in the future. And that's surprising, because I believed inspections leads to more understanding of the asset. But probably it's a question of NDT, right tools available. But overwhelmingly, 70% of the people believe prediction, adopting digital and analytics and continuous monitoring is the way forward into the future. I'm very happy to see that personally, because Corrosion Radar believes in that philosophy, and the audience is endorsing that philosophy. But it brings to the question of when we say digital predictive analytics, what is happening in the industry? What are the promises? Is it even RBI is a predictive tool, right, from the design perspective? So when we say prediction, what comes to your mind? Starting with Bruce.
I'll just go back to Billy mentioned about the data, because you see it firsthand, where to do the prediction and the analytics, you need the good data. So some of the stuff I've been looking at dates back 10 years, 15 years. When you look at the history of data to trend it, it's very much word-based. So setting the foundations of what data is needed, why do we need it, and how are we going to trend it. A lot of the historic inspection reports, standalone, are good reports, but you just can't trend them. So the data analytics, I think that's the way forward, but we really need to get some common theme on the data we require to trend. So there's just archives and archives of old data, but it's not, I would say it's not good data. It needs so much manual cleansing to use. Hence, if you've got a new installation, then you can set the standards from day one with trending data. That's got to be the way forward.
And so you mentioned use the data to predict the future, the past to the future. And I believe there's a lot of activity within oceaneering which you are trying to bring about to use history to predict and bring best practices. Can you give one or two examples of that, Bruce, as to how historical data of the asset is being used to predict aspects of CUI? Is it through RBI processes, or is it through separate modeling and locations?
A bit of both. We're trying to reinvent the whole RBA process and use predictive analytics, trend data. The big problem is the data that we're using, historic, is not easy to manipulate. But the whole leveraging all the data for CUI, there's lots of parameters. So we want to see that happen almost invisibly in the background, where it's between sensors, input and inspection results. So it really removes a lot of friction if we can automate a lot of this process. But it's it's not an easy development. But that's where we're looking at in the future to really get that embedded.
Thank you. Yeah, Billy, when the audience says they want to go with more digital and predictive analytics and probably monitoring, what comes to your mind? What are you seeing trends in the industry?
So I think it's absolutely aligned with my own thoughts. I think there is some work going on in the industry along those lines. Some of the work that the OGTC are doing, they're certainly going down that road. But as Bruce has alluded to, it's really the depth and breadth of the information that we need. It's a real struggle to capture that. And to be honest, I think there's a lot of hard work to capture that before we get to the stage where we can actually start automating that process. But to me, it's key going forward. We need to collect that detailed data that we just don't have at the moment.
Great. So it's a great punchline, Billy, from you. It's a depth and breadth required, collation of data, expert knowledge for the future analytics.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this brings me to the closing question of this session. One thing which you take away or you want audience to go away with, starting with Billy. What is that one thing from this panel session or in general CUI, the message you want to give to this community? How do you manage it better?
I think first and foremost, the message has got to be, this is a safety and integrity issue. The consequences of CUI failures can be extremely serious. And we need to try and escalate that message. When we're trying to educate people on CUI, part of that education is the consequences of failure can be catastrophic. And therefore, our efforts that we need to apply to that have got to be quite intensive. And that goes from the data analysis to NDT to justifying budgets, whatever it is. CUI is a really important topic for the industry.
Great. Thank you. CUI is important. Lives are involved.
Correct.
And a whole big community of not only management, budget, NDT, technology, and analytics needs to come together and look at it seriously. Bruce, your last closing comments, one thing which you would like to give a message to this community.
Yeah, it's really what does good look like 10 years from now. So if we're a blank sheet of paper, what would we like to see 10 years in the future? So it's into the data science, the predictive analytics, the sensors, the automation, the digital twins, and how do we do that? And it's really let's get on that journey now, so that when we do put people offshore, then we can focus on surgical interventions, the proactive maintenance, repair and refurbishment. So we're really getting value for money.
All right, thank you. So it's really justification of value for money and as well as saving lives. CUI is a big industry issue. So thank you for your comments, and I hope the coffee session is over now. We will go to question answers. We have so many questions coming in from the audience. Hopefully we can answer most of them, and we'll try to give mic to one or two people or some few people depending on the time. So the first question coming in is, how do we make sure that the financial decision makers understand the risks involved with not taking proper actions of CUI precautions at CapEx stage? How can we make that happen? And I find that operators are genuinely surprised that they have a CUI problem with uncoated pipe in CUI service. Bruce, do you want to take that? And then I'll give it to Billy. Short answer.
Great. So I'm just looking at the questions here. Is that on our? Can you ask that one again, please?
No. So it says, how can we make financial decision makers understand the risks involved with the CUI at the CapEx stage? Bruce?
Yeah, it's back to the education. So it really is. I see the end users being focal to inputting into the CapEx. So they need to be setting the standards. The operators need to say the standards have got to be robust from day one. So the money needs invested to reap the rewards later on. It's got to happen.
So that's a good point. So set the standards or guidelines that design needs to consider the probably CUI as a late stage. Is it a question of life cycle management? Probably the life cycle
for sure.
of the asset. Yeah. Billy, your comment on this? What you see as a success in the past with your efforts?
I think we touched on it. I think getting the right people in place on a project, getting the right specifications and standards, and then getting the right level of surveillance throughout the project to ensure that your coating specification is being met, your insulation specification is being met as well.
Thank you. So the other question which is coming in from Rosen Group is, how do we bring together all various operating companies, like service companies and various organizations like HOIS and OGTC? There should be much more cooperation with all the parties to help support this major integrity threat. And I believe we require a center of excellence to bring all the historical and ongoing challenges. Billy, what do you comment on this question?
So the Energy Institute have recently reconstituted a sort of CUI network, CUI forum. There was a meeting last year. The first meeting last year was in Aberdeen. So that is one method of sharing, because that's open to all operators and service companies. But yeah, I think there is a point to be considered. Does CUI require a little bit more, something a bit more regular, a bit more international, to share knowledge and divest knowledge?
So Energy Institute is one forum, CUI forum. I think there's a need for this international community to get together in a CUI forum. And Energy Institute is one example. Do you think from your, I think Rebecca was on the panel earlier, OGTC. So how can international community be involved in efforts like OGTC and Energy Institute?
I think that's the challenge. How can we, it's a bit like the data gathering challenge. How can we set up some sort of organization mechanism that we can internationally share? That question's got still to be answered.
That's great. I think one of the objectives of CUI or COFFEE is to break that barrier internationally and bring people, discuss it together, probably more formally at some stage. At the moment, we are discussing at the umbrella stage overall issues. So I think international cooperation is required. Bruce, Bruce, are you aware of any international organizations which are tackling this, bringing across the globe into one platform? Or is it the Europe and UK are specifically taking lead in this?
Yeah, no, my experience is between OGTC and the recent Energy Institute forum that basically, was it last November? They would be due one in May. So it's every 6 months, but it's really just getting started again.
Yep.
So there's definite gap internationally. I mean, the operators and the big oil companies have got their international operations and their centres, but sharing it amongst all the operators is then the next step. It's a definite gap, I'd say. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So moving on to the next question, which is coming from Argentina. I think this is an interesting question. We'll give a mic to Jorge Garofoli. So I'll request the moderator to give the mic to him to ask this question directly.
Hello.
Okay, what is your question? Can you spell for the panel, please?
Well, from my very simplified point of view, the main pathway to lead the management to get a commitment against any problem in the industry is numbers, is money. They run a business. That's the key of the issue. And if we can, it's not an easy job. It's not an easy task. But if we can't put these problems in numbers, that will be certainly help us to justify any technology decision, any improvement, any set of standards, whatever we need to take the problem. So that would be an output, I guess, from the data collection you were mentioned before. My question was if you, in your experience, have any of these numbers in your mind, roughly, even that, but just to put some numbers and to have an idea of how much was the impact in the business from these problems in the, I don't know, oil and gas industry, petrochemicals, whatever you have in your mind.
So thank you. Jorge, which industry do you represent? And which
I work in the petrochemical fertilizer company from Argentina. Property.
All right. Okay. So petrochemical fertilizers in Argentina. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Question to Billy, how that quantification can be done on the economic impact of CUI so that management understands that. What do you do?
So it's a great question from Jorge, and it's we're all engineers. Sometimes we have difficulty in pulling the figures together for cost-benefit analysis, because ultimately that's what it is. It's a cost-benefit analysis, and it's the figures that get action. The other thing that gets action is a painful outage. There have been some fairly recent outages in the North Sea. 10 days lost production from a fairly high producer due to CUI. That gets the message across. But with respect to cost-benefit analysis, I think again the Energy Institute is kicking off a project that's looking at this whole process of how we can pull together cost-benefit analysis figures for asset integrity issues. And I think that may go some way to helping the likes of Jorge produce some figures to justify management taking the right action.
Thank you. Yeah, so the cost-benefit analysis needs to be done at the plant level and the industry level. So Energy Institute, like bodies, they should come up with standard guidelines on the cost-benefit analysis.
And the Energy Institute are just in the process of kicking off a project on that very topic.
Great. I think we have an interesting question from Gino Delancher, who was our previous panel guest and editor of N55 CUI guidelines. We'll give mic to Gino if you're available. Gino, also if you can or want to activate your camera, just share your video as well so that we can see you. So Gino, over to you. What's your question about? Can we unmute Gino? Right, I think the microphone is not unmuted at the moment, but let me spell the question while we are sorting that out. The question from Gino is, what do you think about the knowledge level about CUI mitigation action? Is it related to material choice or design experiences from the engineering company? What do you think on that? Is it technical? Is there a gap there? I think Bruce, I'll go with you on this question. Is there a knowledge gap about CUI from materials point of view or design point of view?
Yeah, potentially yes. Some of the work I'm looking to get involved in involves working with the engineering companies to do a inspectability and design for the future. So the design engineers, a lot of them will not be up to speed with the CUI problems 20 years down the line. So it's feeding back the lessons learned into the design. So it's yeah, for sure there'll be design engineers that just don't have the experience. CUI is folk like me and Billy that's been involved in it for decades. So there's definitely an input there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think Gino is having mic issues, so we'll park that. And moving to the next question, it's coming from Gopal Kamal. I'll actually pass the mic to Gopal Kamal if it is possible for the moderator, and then unmute it, and probably you can share your video as well and ask the question directly, Gopal, to the panel. What's your question about? And if you can unmute your microphone, or panel moderator can unmute the microphone. Gopal, would you like to ask a question about this, or I can actually um, spell out the question as well? It says, does the moisture barrier leads to an acceptance of the issue and a lack of prioritization in the face of other risks take precedence? In the sense, I think Gopal is trying to ask about the moisture barrier. Once it is broken, what is there any action taken at all, or is it prioritized or not, or should it be prioritized or not? Because moisture or water is a key issue for CUI. I think that's what the question is. Gopal, is our understanding correct, or do you want to add to it? Hi Gopal, are you able to hear us? Okay, I think we will move to this question. Billy, what do you think of this question as to, once we know moisture, and it's all not only from offshore but probably onshore as well, it may be coming from another region, so onshore or on land. So what do you think on the moisture barrier once it's broken? How is it responded?
I think the problem we have in the environments that we work in, you have a lot of exposed pipework. It's a harsh marine environment, and to be absolutely honest with you, I think it's probably virtually impossible to guarantee you can keep the moisture out. You have to make best efforts. Obviously, if you see damage to insulation, you should try and get it resealed. But some of these moisture ingress points are fairly subtle, and I think it's just an impossible ask to keep moisture out.
Right, so it's difficult problem to address, and typically it is not addressed at the right time. Bruce, what do you think on this moisture barrier once broken? What happens and what should be done?
Yeah, it's certainly there'll be areas that are a lot higher risk than others. So if the moisture barriers, if it's broken, if it's inch thick piping, if it's dependent on the pressure, so it depends on corrosion rate, temperature. So it's really understanding where's the risks. I think which areas need attention sooner. Some of the CUI could take many years to get to an issue. So the moisture barrier and that may not be the priority, but certainly the thin wall carbon steel hot stuff is, yeah, it goes up the priority, and it's the areas you'd want to address straight away. So it's, as Billy said, to have all moisture barriers intact it's near impossible on these complex platforms. Yeah.
Right.
But it's all in the risk-based assessment and the models that we need to
Right.
manage.
Okay. So risk-based inspections and models comes into picture about tackling moisture information. All right. So next question is actually coming towards me. What is the role of corrosion radar in development of CUI management procedures? Happy to answer this question, but long story short, corrosion radar is about development of sensors and monitoring devices to locate where the risks are, moisture, etc. are. So that's a short answer. But if you'd like more details, you can always email us. The other question is coming is, what the CUI strategy, how is it different for aging assets versus the new build assets? I think we have partly answered it, but quick comments on that, Bruce. A new build versus old assets, how the strategy changes of CUI management. What would be the main challenges there?
A new build asset is, well, that's a better position to be in because you're starting very early. You can be a lot more proactive in the new build, that's for sure. In the aging ones give me more of a concern because you could really be overwhelmed with issues on some of the aging assets where you've got bad insulation, you've got coating, unknown coating. There could be significant uncertainty and risk in the aging assets without doing a lot of intervention, inspection and maintenance. So the new builds, I would certainly try and get good foundations in there.
Right. Okay. So the next question is about, what you mentioned, Billy, earlier is how do you educate and provide confidence to the inspection engineers on the use of emerging technologies? Because oil and gas, traditionally conservative industry, but now is trying to adopt new technologies. So the question is about how do you bring confidence and education to inspection engineers to adopt emerging technologies? Billy?
It's a very good question, because traditionally, I think if you look at how we've tackled the CUI problem, there's been some emphasis on NDT. So it's how we kind of look at that population of technicians and engineers and give them the opportunity of potentially upskilling to move from an inspection regime to a monitoring regime. So I think we have to, part of the education piece is to make it exciting and appealing, and to give them a glimpse of their role in the future. It's not redundant. They have a role to play for us in the future, but it does mean that they probably need to upskill themselves to move from an inspection regime to a monitoring regime, different technologies, etc.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. And so I think we are just reaching towards the end, and there are so many questions we are unanswered. Some of them will answer all the emails, but we are willing to extend this session by about 15 minutes. Now, I believe panel members may have challenges in their schedules, but if you are available, please stay on. If you have to go, then please feel free. We will extend the session to about another 15 minutes to answer as many questions, and also we'll give mic to some of the people if they want. So towards the audience, if you want to stay on, we have another 15 minutes. If you want to ask questions, feel free to write it. If you want to talk, just raise your hands. In the bottom of the screen, you can click an option of raising your hand, and that will tell us whether you have something to contribute or tell. We'll give you the mic to you depending on the time. So, Bruce, Billy, what's your schedule for the next 15 minutes like?
Yeah, I'm afraid I've got to go at 12.
All right.
Yeah, but certainly if you have any questions for me, Praful,
Yeah.
just put them in an email and I'll get back to you within the week maybe.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Billy. And any closing remarks, Billy, before you go? And before you do that, I'll just ask Bruce as well. Bruce, how's your schedule like?
I was similar to Billy. I have a meeting in 2 minutes, so I was going to join that one.
All right. Okay. So I will stay on and try to address it, and we will see what questions we can pass it on to you. Any closing remarks, Billy, and then we'll pass it on to Bruce before you go.
We've spoken a lot today about late life, but CUI can be an early life problem as well. So don't get complacent that you have a shiny brand new asset and you don't have a CUI problem. That is not the case. You need to be vigilant from day one.
So being vigilant from day one, it's a design issue as well. It's a late life issue as well, but be vigilant from early on. So
absolutely.
That's the message from Billy. Thank you for that. Bruce, your last comments before you leave?
It's gone back to the question from Argentina about the cost benefit. So I've been working some of them numbers relatively recently, and I do see good cost benefits when you weigh up everything with the insulation removal, especially offshore with helicopters bedding, and when you take in production losses and all that good stuff, I do see significant cost benefits if it's done right. Yeah.
Right. So cost benefit analysis is the key towards this towards this problem, so that the management and the right stakeholders get involved. So that's a closing comment from Bruce. Thank you, Billy and Bruce, for joining us today. More questions, we'll pass it on to you, and we'll respond to all the attendees. And I appreciate you taking time today, and looking forward to working with you again, on the issue of CUI. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Praful.
Cheers, Praful. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. So towards the audience, I think, because we have so much of interest on the question answers, if some of you would like to interact, we'll probably give mic to you. Just raise your hands in the bottom part of the panel webinar. There's a tab called raise hand, and then we can interact for the next 15 minutes, question answers, depending on the kind of questions you have. So another question, meanwhile, which is being asked is, so there seems to be Geert from WCM from Netherlands, world-class maintenance, is saying that he's surprised that one of the questions which we asked was about the skills, CUI management and the gaps in the CUI management, and the gap in the skills was rated highly by the audience. So that's an interesting point, and we have been getting this consistently from various operators, that you can make best guidelines, you can make best tools, technologies, but if the skills are limited, which depends on experience and experience levels, if they are limited, we can't enforce the best management guidelines. Say, for example, coatings needs to be done in a particular way, and if it is not applied properly according to the guidelines, it will lead to bad effects, coating damages and CUI. So skills are key, and that's been one of the major hurdles. So I agree with here that this is surprising, but not surprising, that it's still an issue that needs to be tackled. So we have an audience member, Abdul Rashid. Welcome to this session. You have a question, Abdul?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I wanted to know the major features that are to be considered when analyzing the data from the asset, from the sensors.
So you're talking about the data from the sensors, you mean, or historical data of the asset?
The historical data of the asset.
Right. So as far as the CUI management is concerned, as Bruce mentioned in the panel discussion, that historical data is one aspect, but RBI is also another aspect. So risk-based inspections is identifying the risks to the different parts of the asset. Say, for example, a particular pipeline, the risks to that pipelines are governed by their operational and design cycles. So that is tackled by risk-based inspections. Say you have a design aspects of it, temperature, a type of insulation, type of material, drying and wetting cycles, or say temperature cycles. So that data goes into the risk-based inspection procedures, of course, and then it identifies the risks. But when it comes to historical data, many times the risks are increased or decreased depending on the historical data. And that's where the sensors comes into picture, because in the operations, normally the operational data, historical data comes from inspections. Say people do visual inspections or even NDT. So that data is used for future inspections. And now what we are standing for, Corrosion Radar as a company, and others, many our peers in the industry are standing for, is how do we bring the power of sensors and data to manage this problem in the future. Say, can we build a historical history of this, say, asset? Say, water is coming in on the insulation. Can we detect it? Can we find evidence of where the corrosivity is? So all this data and the temperature cycles of that from the operational power plant. So all this data comes and becomes a kind of prediction tool that, okay, this is where the CUI is likely to happen. So coming from RBI is a design-driven process for risks, and coming from sensors and analytics is operations-based understanding of the risks. So the two different parts. So that's how it's being done today. More sensors, more historical data, but there's so much of work to be done in this, and I think everybody is trying to understand how can this be managed better in analytics. So that's our understanding right now, Abdul. which industry you represent and which geography you're coming from.
I'm from the mechanical design.
Right, so mechanical industry. Okay, thank you, Abdul.
Thank you.
Rashid. So let's see other questions which we have, which is, so one of the question is about what are the typical problems which we face when we talk about deployment of, say, sensors? What are the typical questions? So, I can answer that very well because we are coming from that background on sensors. The first question is, normally we are asked is, CUI, how is the cost benefit analysis of installing and monitoring an asset? So for that, normally we get together with the end user and understand the data as to how much they are spending, what is the shutdown costs, what is the probability of shutdown, and in effect, what is the inspection procedures for the next few years. If you take about 12-year cycle, when do you inspect and how much percentage do you inspect? Say, do you inspect every 5 years? And how much percentage of the pipeline do you strip visual inspections, and what is the cost involved? So we take that into account, and then try to propose that if you install monitoring at the time when the inspection is already happening, that's where you install the sensors. Then from next time onward, you reduce the zone of inspection to only where it is required. So it's a data-driven inspection rather than RBI. So basically making RBI process more intelligent and making them more data-driven. So that's the future of it. And that reduces the zone of inspection to very precise inspection. We call it surgical inspection. And that saves the cost because now you're not talking about 100% of the pipeline or 50% of the pipeline. You're talking about probably 1 or 2% of the pipeline where the issues are. So that's the cost benefit analysis normally. And then when to install it is when you have to remove the insulation. So that's the typical discussions. And then the most opportunistic time is when the insulation is being removed during a turnaround, etc. So that's typical of it. So let's see any other question which is coming in. Of course, there are so many questions, and so the other question which is coming in about the type of insulation and the impact on the CUI. Well, I mean, this is a big issue because many times the insulation is being used as mineral wool. Many times the insulation is used as rock wool, and these are the lowest cost insulation. And the problem is these insulation soaks water. And that's where the problem is. Rainwater comes in or condensation happens on the outside of the pipe. It starts to corrode from outside without we can notice it. So over time, the insulation industry have moved on to better insulations, say hydrophobic insulations. The core issue is whatever people can claim, manufacturers can claim that this is the best insulation. It takes many years before a confidence is built up, probably 10 years before the confidence is built up in the developments. And the same goes with coatings. People can come up with the best coatings, but you can only try them in the laboratories and prove it. But when it comes to the field, it takes many, many years before the confidence is built up. So what do we do in between? And that's where, again, technologies of analytics and monitoring comes into picture, that till you build a confidence in barriers, you can monitor the asset and take a risk mitigation approach. So let's see any other question which is coming up. If you have any comment to make or question, just raise your hands in one of the tabs which is in the question answers, and the moderator will pass on the mic to you to do that. So other questions which is unanswered is, does the panel feel the same level of focus is placed on carbon steel versus stainless steel on CUI issues? I think this pretty much goes to the operators, but from my perspective, what I see in the industry is carbon steel is the core issue of CUI, but stainless steel is also an issue because stainless steel does not corrode, but it goes through a stress corrosion cracking. Now, stress corrosion cracking can be not a long-term issue, but it can be very catastrophic even in short term. Say once a crack initiates, for example, a catalytic converter in a chemical industry, if a crack is developing over time, that is catastrophic. And industry tries to avoid that crack at best. And what we try to say to them is it's not a CUI issue. It is a stress corrosion cracking, but the crack is developed because of presence of salts, chlorides, and water. Water is a precursor. If we can monitor the water, where the water is coming in, we know the risks where the cracks are likely to develop. So it's about better understanding the risks of the asset rather than having a turnaround every few years, an inspection every few years. Can we understand real time the risks by putting on analytics and sensors? And in this case, we have water sensors or moisture sensors around insulated stainless steel structures. So CUI is not only for carbon steel, but I think stainless steel also can be managed from stress corrosion point of view. So the other question which is coming from Chris is coatings perspective. We are talking about end of life assets and the dangers of CUI. Do the panel feel there should be a minimum industry standard creator for maintenance systems and not just new build relating to surface preparation, coating specifications, and life expectancy due to importance and dangers of CUI? So again, I think we'll answer that on the email with Billy and Bruce, but I think my experience is that coatings have come a long way, and they are traditionally designed for atmospheric corrosion, but CUI has posed a big issue because there's very little understanding of behavior of coatings in CUI conditions, because CUI can be different. Irrespective of that, I think there have been guidelines like thermally sprayed aluminum being proposed as a best practice for coatings. So there have been so many progress in the guidelines of coatings, but the gap remains about how do we enforce that the installers and coating providers, people who are putting coatings in the field on the pipelines, they are sticking to those guidelines. How do we enforce it? That's the difficulty the industry is facing right now in management of CUI, that you can have the best guidelines and best coatings, but is it applied as per the procedures? And that's where the challenges are. And again, view from monitoring is, if we can monitor it, that's the best, even after applications. So I think we have reached the end of our session. If there are any last minute points, and if somebody wants to raise hands, the mic can be given. Our moderator will give the mic. There are many other questions which are coming in unaddressed. I think we have several questions which gives the success to this CUI community. I hope you are all safe and well, and continue to be safe and keep carry on in this environment. We'll be back. We'll be announcing our next session with panel guest which will be scheduled in 2 weeks' time. We'll announce shortly in the next few days. Please do send us email on webinars@corrosionradar.com. Please do like or follow our LinkedIn page, where we announce the events and expand this CUI community. If you do have some vision, or you would like to participate and you have some contributions to make as form of panel or questions, please do email us. If there are applications you would like to discuss, we'll be gathering different industry guests and bringing it together. So that brings me to the end of this session. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took at least one takeaway from this. Keep safe, and good luck in these times. Thank you for that. Thank you for joining us.